This video is sponsored by ThinkSpace. Woodwinds are one of the main sections of the orchestra, but compared to strings and brass that I've already explored in previous videos, woodwind instruments are actually quite diverse and can differ quite significantly from each other in how they produce their sound and what they actually sound like. So in this video we're going to look at the variety of woodwind instruments we can find in the orchestra and the ones that we can't really find in the orchestra. We're going to talk about what range they can play, their tone, their quality, and look at some famous music in which they're used. And stick around to the end for the quiz where I'll be playing you short extracts of different woodwind instruments and you have to identify which woodwind instrument it is by how they sound. So what actually defines a woodwind instrument? Well, all woodwinds create their sound by splitting or vibrating the air that's blown into them on some sort of edge. That air then passes down a pipe, the length of which dictates the pitch of the note. And then you can effectively change the length of the pipe, and thus the pitch, by using the keys or holes on the instrument. But this sharp edge that the air is blown onto can vary, and that's what gives us the different types of woodwind instrument. For example, in a clarinet or a saxophone, the sharp edge is a reed, a short sharp piece of cane that vibrates as you blow onto it. Some other woodwind instruments like the oboe, the bassoon or the cor anglais use a double reed where there are two bits of cane that vibrate against each other. But many woodwind instruments don't use a reed at all. For example, a flute where the sharp edge is just an open hole that is blown across to create the sound. Or the sharp edge could be what we call a fipple, the open hole at the end of a recorder or an ocarina or a tin whistle. Now, although woodwind instruments come in many shapes and sizes, there's four main types really, the four types of player you will find in an orchestra, and those are the flutes, the oboes, the clarinets, and the bassoons. Smaller orchestras will have two of each of these players, but you could have up to three of each of these players. But we can find other woodwind instruments in the orchestra, and that's because many woodwind players in these main four categories will do what's called doubling, where in addition to their main instrument, for example flute, they will also play an auxiliary instrument, which will be some sort of variation on that main instrument. One of the flautists will probably also play the piccolo, a smaller variation of the flute that offers an even higher range, the highest range of any woodwind instrument in the orchestra. In the same way, one of the oboists in the orchestra will likely play the cor anglais, effectively an alto version of the oboe, a lower range instrument with a rich tone. Now, the cor anglais is French for English horn, which can be a bit confusing because there is also another instrument in the brass section of the orchestra called the French horn. So here we have the cor anglais, which is called the English horn, but using the French language, and then over here we have the French horn, but it's described with the English language. It's a bit confusing, but just remember that the cor anglais is a woodwind and the French horn is a brass instrument. So when players double like this, they may be switching between their two instruments during the same piece, adding another level of technicality to being a woodwind player. For example, in Bartók's Dance Suite, during the first movement, all the bassoonists are playing regular bassoon, but for the second movement, one of them switches onto the contrabassoon that they have set up ready next to them to switch onto when needed. The bassoon is already the bass instrument of the woodwind family, so the contrabassoon is offering an even deeper range, an even lower pitched instrument. In the same way that the piccolo offers an extra octave at the top of the woodwind's range in the orchestra, the contrabassoon offers an extra octave at the bottom. Now here on screen you can see the range of all of the main woodwind instruments that we have in the orchestra, but be aware that although the bottom note of their range is fixed, is non-negotiable because it's the entire length of their pipework, the top note of the range can be flexible, and basically just the higher you go, the less quality and less pleasant and usable that top note becomes. So each of these instruments basically just has a highest range that you probably don't want to venture too far into. So I would teach you in this video how to write for these instruments, how to write for the woodwind section or for the individual instruments in the woodwind section. But the thing is, I don't actually have any real personal experience of doing this. So instead, I think a great way that you can learn how to write for not only woodwinds, but all sorts of orchestral instruments is with the courses available over at ThinkSpace, today's sponsor. Here you can learn how to write for these instruments from experienced composers who have actually written for famous film and TV scores, with the main tutor being Guy Michelmore, who you may know from his fantastic YouTube videos. He's a wonderfully natural and charismatic teacher. You can use my exclusive coupon code DAVID35 to get 35% off the on-demand courses on ThinkSpace. They have courses on all sorts of aspects of music, including music theory, but I think if you're enjoying this video so far, a great place to start would be how to write cinematic music, where Guy shows you how to achieve that classic Hollywood sound using woodwinds, strings, and the rest of the orchestra. Use the link down below to find out more. Now, something you may have been thinking in this video so far is, what is the actual difference between the woodwinds and the brass instruments? Don't they both make sound by effectively blowing air into them? Well, they are very similar, but there's one distinct difference, which is that in a brass instrument, the player is vibrating their lips, effectively blowing a raspberry down the instrument, and that's what creates the tone, that's what resonates the air.
Low note. High note.
Whereas in the woodwind, as we described earlier, the breath, the air is blown over this sharp edge, maybe a reed or something else, and that is what creates the resonant frequency in the pipe. If you want to learn more about brass instruments, then do check out my previous video about how they work. Also, you may be wondering, why are woodwinds called woodwind when many of them are clearly not made from wood? Well, that is a historical hangover, because historically woodwind instruments were made pretty much exclusively from wood, but as time went on, metal became a more preferable choice for many of these instruments, like the flute for example. So now today many woodwind instruments aren't actually made from wood. Now, an important aspect of woodwind instruments to understand, particularly if you're planning on composing for them, is that many of them are what we call transposing instruments. That means that the notes that they play, the notes that actually sound out of their instrument, don't match the notes that we write for them on the notation. So, for example, when an alto saxophone player reads a C off the page and they play what in their head is a C, the note that actually comes out is an E flat, not a C. Because the alto saxophone is a transposing instrument, it's an instrument that's in E flat. The tenor saxophone is in B flat, so if that same sax player then picked up the tenor saxophone and played the same C on the same notation, now it would sound as a B flat. Now the point of this is to allow players to easily switch between different woodwind instruments. I mentioned earlier that a common thing to happen in woodwinds is doubling, where the same player will be switching between different instruments in that sort of category. We want the player to be able to pick up any of the instruments in the given family and be able to use the same finger positions to get the same notes right. But because of the different shapes and sizes of these instruments, even though the keys, the holes are in the same place, the notes that those instruments create are actually different. It would be like if on different types of keyboard instrument you had the same keyboard layout, but they actually gave you different notes because of the differing sizes of all the instruments. It would be mega confusing. So to allow the woodwind player to seamlessly move between the different instruments in their family, we effectively give them sheet music that's in the wrong key to cancel out the effect of that instrument that they're playing being a different size or shape, and therefore having different notes on each key. The best way to think about it is that normal non-transposing instruments, like for example the piano or the violin, are in C. In the same way that an E-flat clarinet has the key of E-flat, the piano has the key of C. It's the C piano, so to speak. So anything played on the E-flat clarinet will be 3 semitones higher than it should be, at least relative to the piano and any other non-transposing instruments, because there's 3 semitones between E-flat and C. So, for example, if we wanted to write a piece of music that was in the key of D major, we'd actually have to write the E-flat clarinet parts in the key of B major, 3 semitones lower than the actual intended key, because that instrument sounds 3 semitones too high. And this effectively cancels out the difference there in their key and means that everything is actually sounding together in that unified key of D major. So on screen you can see all of the different woodwind instruments and how much they transpose by, if they transpose at all. And you'll notice that some transpose by an octave, which is an easier transposition to get your head around. For example, the contrabassoon is an octave lower than the regular bassoon, so the notes coming out of the contrabassoon are 1 octave lower than the notes the bassoonist is actually reading on the notation. Now, sometimes it can be hard to identify which woodwind instrument you're hearing because they do all have fairly similar tones, but with their own distinct characters. So now what we're going to do is we're going to hear various excerpts of woodwind instruments playing on their own, and you have to guess which one we're hearing. Now, just before we start that, let's briefly go over what we should be listening out for. These are the 8 instruments we might hear during the quiz, effectively the 8 main woodwind instruments. The flute has a light and breathy tone. The oboe has a richer tone than the flute, but it's still quite pure and clear, especially when compared to the clarinet, which has a more rounded tone. It's like we have less high frequency information. It's more warm and sort of nasally. Now the bassoon actually sounds quite similar to the clarinet when it's playing in its higher ranges, but often you'll be hearing it more in its lower ranges because of course it's one of the lowest sounding woodwind instruments we have, so it has quite a rounded but deep tone and can also sound kind of honky as well. Now if you hear a particularly low woodwind sound, it's probably the contrabassoon, which is even lower right than the bassoon. And in the same way, if you hear a particularly high woodwind sound, it's probably the piccolo, right, which is the flute but even higher, so it almost has a sort of whistling, shrill tone. The cor anglais, remember, is effectively the alto oboe, so it's quite similar to the oboe, but it's a little bit deeper in tone and richer in tone. It has almost sort of a melancholic, emotive sound. And sort of the odd one out here is the saxophone. And why I say it's the odd one out is the saxophone doesn't feature in the standard orchestral lineup, although it is occasionally used in orchestral music. If you want more information about why that is, then check out this wonderful video by David Bruce. I've linked down below. But because the saxophone doesn't regularly feature in the orchestra, you can almost hear it by the fact that it sounds almost more jazzy or poppy. It doesn't sound as orchestral. But beyond that, it also has quite a reedy sort of tone, similar to the clarinet. Okay, so now you've got a bit of a cheat sheet on what sound you're looking out for. Let's listen to some clips. Here's clip 1. That was a clarinet. Here's clip 2. That was a saxophone. Here's clip 3. That was an oboe. Number 4. That was a flute. Number 5. That was the cor anglais. Number 6. That was an oboe. Number 7. That was the bassoon. And number 8. That was the piccolo.
That trilobite didn't know an oboe from an elbow.
So let me know down below how you did in that quiz. Remember as well, if you want to learn more about how to write for woodwind instruments or just generally how to write for television and film, then do check out the courses down below offered by ThinkSpace. And if you want to learn about the other sections of the orchestra, the brass section and the string section, then check out my previous videos on those topics.